Beneath the water, amidst a silent lagoon, Solari opened her eyes. The golden scales on her body faded, their light dissolving into the deep mud. On the distant shore, where Willow Bend once stood a village that had been saved, the wind no longer carried songs. Aminah dreamed of that mermaid every night. No longer radiant, Solari was now surrounded by the seaweed of memories, quietly calling Aminah's name, with eyes that seemed to ask, "Is what I gave being wasted?" Aminah jolted awake in the August heat, her heart heavy as stone. The black pearl necklace around her neck bore a thin crack. That had never happened before, unless the covenant of water had been betrayed. Once again, she had to return to the place that had once forsaken her, not to demand justice, but to seek an answer. Why do people hate the one who saved them? And could memories be wielded as a kind of weapon? Not all who vanish are forgotten. Some names are no longer spoken, yet they linger in every corner of the walls, every cluster of trees, every gaze that falls silent when the wind sweeps through the old land. Isela was one such name. A year after the great upheaval in Willow Bend, when the water village had just regained a fragile peace, a strange wind blew in from the south. It carried not the scent of rice or fresh earth, but the faint smell of decayed paper, old ink, and the bitterness of hearts cast out of history. Isela returned on a gloomy afternoon, the wind stirring red dust to cover the steps of the old council house. She didn't knock, didn't offer greetings. The eyes that saw her fell silent. No one spoke, but their hands tightened on wooden railings as if suppressing anger. Once, she had been a cautious, skillful woman, keeping records and mediating the silent representative of the Hammond family when Corey held power. When everything collapsed, Isela was branded a conspirator, not condemned, but erased through forgetting. She left the village without a word of complaint, but within her, a smoldering wound never healed. No one knew where she had gone. Some said she went to Baton Rouge, working as a clerk in a law office. Others whispered she lived in a house by the bay, lighting incense daily to summon the spirits of things lost. But now, there was no need to guess. Isela stood there, still as a gravestone, her eyes devoid of hatred but empty, as if the only thing anchoring her was a single thread, her lost honor. She didn't return to apologize, nor to clear her name. In Isela's hand was a proposal, a plan to develop a new ecotourism route inspired by the very tale of the mermaid and the healer who revived Willow Bend. She presented it to the new council with smooth, articulate words, the hallmark of someone once familiar with justice and gain. But beneath every line lay a familiar scent, the scent of greed disguised as the ideal of restoration. Aminah knew. From the first glance, as a child, she had sat watching Isela work behind a wooden desk, her black fountain pen gliding swiftly over pages of minutes. She remembered that hand never trembled when it cut aid for the elderly or signed agreements with Corey to build water pipelines without community consultation. That same hand now held a plan to save the lagoon, the very thing Aminah and Solari had sacrificed everything to preserve. Solari. Her name was like an unhealed wound in Aminah's heart. For countless nights, she had dreamed of golden scales glinting beneath the water, calling her back. But in reality, Solari had vanished since the day the villagers remembered the truth. No one saw her anymore. No songs, no shimmering waves of scales. Only clean water remained, and memories, but memories are fragile. And Isela knew that. She didn't need to poison the lagoon. She only needed to turn it into a product, an entry ticket, a tool to control collective memory by packaging it as a commodity. Isela didn't shout, didn't preach, but each step she took was a silent accusation against this village, against Aminah, and perhaps against Solari herself. If a person cannot reclaim their honor, they will make everyone kneel in shame. Aminah stood silently by the water's edge. The black pearl necklace around her neck was still cracked. The waves rippled gently. Her heart grew cold as she recalled Solari's words, "Memories don't vanish, they are stolen." Was Willow Bend losing itself once again? What happens when memories become a commodity? And who will stand up this time? Serenity is not always peace. Sometimes it is the quiet before an impending upheaval. And in Willow Bend, the channels that once babbled like the lifeblood silently nourishing the community's memories suddenly ran dry. The villagers didn't understand why. The willows along the riverbank wilted despite the warm month. The birds ceased their morning songs. Children ran to the lagoon's edge to play as usual, but when they sang the old lullaby, they stopped mid-verse. Not because they forgot the words, but because the echo had vanished. Aminah, now living with the Gullah community on Alabama's coast, received a handwritten letter, brief and unsigned. "The water is being falsified. Willow Bend is drying up. You need to return." No one but Solari could have sent such a message. But Solari had been gone for a long time. Aminah looked down at her neck, where the black pearl necklace had followed her through countless seasons. A faint crack had appeared on its surface, like a fracture on the glass, reflecting her soul. That only happened when the covenant of water, the sacred pact between the mermaid and the village's spirit, was violated. She set out without warning. She left behind her notebook, her small blooming garden, and a man who had proposed but to whom she hadn't yet responded. Sometimes, personal love must yield to the duty owed to a thirsting community. Willow Bend was no longer the village of old. The scenery looked familiar, but its soul had changed. Outside, billboards advertised renovation projects. Motorboats bearing tourism logos sliced through the lagoon's waters. But beneath the surface, mud rose in thick layers, viscous and foul-smelling. The elders no longer dared to drink from the wells. Children developed rashes on their skin. Everyone felt something was wrong, but no one could name it. Isela had begun constructing a new water diversion system. According to her plan, the lagoon would now be connected to an artificial treatment network to protect the environment and enhance the tourism experience. It sounded noble, but Aminah knew that when water ceased to be water, memories ceased to be memories. They would become nothing more than a reprogrammed version, easier to control. She wandered the village, silently observing. Those who once called her name with gratitude now avoided her gaze, not out of forgetfulness, but out of unease. They were thankful for Aminah, but they also wanted to move on, and she was a reminder of what they wished to leave behind. That evening, she stood by the lagoon, quietly dipping her hand into the water. It was no longer cool as it once was. It no longer pulsed like a living entity. Instead, it was cold, sluggish, and lifeless. A fish floated by, its belly bloated, its eyes milky white. In that moment, she knew Solari was in pain. The crack on the black pearl widened. Tiny golden flecks rolled along its edge, glimmering like tears from a distant realm. Aminah bowed her head into her hands, silent. Without Solari saying a word, she understood the covenant wasn't just betrayed. It was being distorted, commercialized, and suffocated by beautifully worded excuses. Soon after, she discovered the new pumping system, digging deep into the lagoon's bed, a technology that extracted memories through ultrasonic waves, promoted as preserving the original sound of the water. But when she secretly set up a recorder, the sound it captured was only a piercing screech, like the scream of a spirit torn from its sanctuary. Aminah knew she could not stay silent, But this time, she was no longer the hero cheered by the crowd. She was the one disrupting the newly formed illusion of stability. The one reminding them of old pain, just as they had learned to ignore it. She had to choose. Keep warning them, or step back and let everything collapse again. Deep within the lagoon, a faint ripple stirred. Beneath the thick layer of mud, a pair of golden eyes flickered open, but not to call Aminah's name, to demand the truth. Dear audience, stay tuned for the next thrilling installment. Take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see who's joining us from around the world. No one noticed the woman in a black cloth shawl stepping off the last bus of the day at the village's edge. Under the fading autumn sunlight, she drew no attention, and that was what she wanted. Aminah didn't return with titles, nor with fanfare or radiant glory. She came back to Willow Bend like a pilgrim, wearied, silent, and carrying a heavy burden in her heart. No one called her name, but the ground beneath her feet still whispered old memories. The village had changed. New houses were built with light-colored wood and bright red tin roofs, things unheard of before. They looked clean and modern. But the earth beneath their foundations was cracked, dry, and white, splitting into patches like an old person's skin. Adults gathered to discuss opening another resort. A group of foreign tourists passed by, snapping photos by the ancient well, once a place of ancestral worship. Children coughed incessantly, some wearing masks as if it had become routine. She walked through the paths, noting in her mind the changes made without the village's consent. But what stopped her in her tracks was at the forest's edge, the forbidden lagoon, untouched for 100 years, now being excavated. A long ditch, straight as a knife, wound through Mother Earth's belly, stretched from the new villa complex to the sacred water. The roar of the excavator echoed like a curse unearthed from a grave. Aminah knelt and dipped her hand into the soil. It was cold, unfeeling. Gone was the special tremor she once felt. The covenant was being broken day by day, not by words of denial, but by silent, ruthless actions. And then, at the village square, where she had once been accused years ago, a new signboard had been erected. Beneath gleaming metal letters reading, Solari Sanctuary, sponsored by the Heritage Revival Fund, was an image of the mermaid with golden scales, redrawn without her true radiance, turned into a forced, commercialized marketing symbol. Aminah stood still for a long time. In her chest, the black pearl necklace grew cold, its crack nearly spanning the entire surface. Solari had never asked to be a mascot. She was a spirit. And now, that spirit was framed for promotion. That night, Aminah slept in the old hut near the lagoon's edge, where Miss Maisie once grew mint and set out a wooden chair to read scripture. But that night, the water didn't lap against the shore as it used to. Instead, it rippled in small waves like stifled sobs. In her dream, a faint golden light rose from the lagoon's depths, not shimmering, but fractured. Solari was weakening. And if the spirit of the water faded, Willow Bend's memories would sink with it. The next morning, Aminah resolved to act. She wrapped her face in the black shawl and quietly approached the construction site near the forbidden lagoon. Through a gap in the fence, she saw a familiar figure, Isela. Not a blurry image from the past, a real isela calm, pointing, giving orders, holding a design map. Her eyes were sharp as knives, as if she had never been exiled, never humiliated. But something was different. Isela was no longer the silent aide. She was the leader. She was the one directing the digging of that ditch. Aminah didn't step forward. She wasn't ready to confront her yet. But it was clear this was no mere coincidence. Someone was trying to awaken what the ancestors had instructed to let sleep. And if the spirit of the water grew angry, it wouldn't just be Willow Bend that paid the price. An entire people's memory, the lullabies, the prayers, the stories told by firelight could all be swept away once again. She turned to leave, her heart heavy, for she knew, this time, the truth didn't just need to be retold. It had to be defended with blood, tears, and, once again, forgiveness. But forgiveness for whom? And was there still time? Have you ever forgiven someone who touched the most sacred part of you? The sky that day wasn't blue. The clouds seemed stretched into threads by some weary hand, casting a mournful gray over the lagoon. Aminah woke from a fragmented dream, where water whispered in human voices and light flowed like blood. She had seen Solari, not the radiant mermaid of legend, but a stranded spirit, bare and tattered, as if time itself had eroded patches of her golden scales. Solari didn't speak much. She only moved her eyes, each blink slicing into Aminah's mind with things words could not express. But in that dream, one thing rang clear. Not everything healed is forgiven. Memory has no shortcuts. Aminah sat up in the darkness, cold sweat clinging to the back of her neck. She looked down at the black pearl necklace around her neck. The crack had reached its core. A chill ran through her, not from her body, but from her soul. What was happening in Willow Bend wasn't just a violation of the covenant. It was vengeance, a betrayal cloaked in the guise of rebirth. She began revisiting the old places where the water had once been sacred. The ancient well was now a tourist rest stop, complete with signs and a vending machine. They had paved the ground with concrete to accommodate visitors. But beneath the bricks, Aminah knew, the water still lived, and it was groaning. She sat there all morning, her hand resting on the well's edge, as if listening to the pulse of the earth. There was no reply. Only a musty smell of pine resin scorched in the Sunday. That evening, she went to the edge of the lagoon, now cordoned off. No one stood guard, because no one thought the heritage land could be violated. But Aminah wasn't violating it. She was returning to ask a question no one dared to voice. Who sold this soul to oblivion? She walked barefoot through the mud. Each step stung as if treading on fragments of herself. And then she heard the sound of water breaking not from outside, but from within her. Solari appeared again, not radiant, not singing, not lifting her up as she had at their first meeting. She stood far off, blurred in the mist, and slowly tilted her head as if asking, "How will you keep your promise? Through forgiveness or punishment?" Aminah didn't answer, but she understood. Willow Bend had chosen selective healing. They thought rebuilding the well, casting statues, and invoking old symbols was enough to soothe Mother Earth. But the Earth didn't need festivals. It needed honesty. It needed memory intact, even the painful parts. And Isela, she wasn't just digging a ditch. She was rewriting history. She wanted to control the collective memory, erasing past sins, crafting a new glory that served her. And if no one stopped her, future generations wouldn't know Solari had lived. They'd only know her as a logo on a bottle of spring water. Aminah returned to the hut, her feet caked in mud, but her heart far heavier. She sat by the fire, watching the flickering flames reflect on the black pearl. In a flash of light, she saw a figure behind her, not Solari, but herself from before. The girl who was exiled, the girl who begged to be believed, the girl who forgave without ever receiving an apology. The wind howled through the door's cracks. She gently touched her chest where the pearl rested. This time, it was no longer cold. It began to warm, as if the spirit of the water, though drained, was still waiting. The central market of Willow Bend was once a gathering place of laughter, the sounds of trade, and stories exchanged like precious goods. But that day, the market didn't laugh. It fell silent before a proclamation that shook the village's soul. Isela, the woman once exiled in silence, now stood in the square, poised, holding up a new map. She didn't call for vengeance. She didn't rally for rebellion. She simply invited those who felt forgotten, those who had lost their voice, those who had bowed their heads in silence. Isela promised a new water system, free from old standards, a new source, unbound by tradition, unshackled by ancestral oaths. At first, no one believed her. But then, a few days later, that water began to flow. Clear, cool, running through channels that Aminah herself had once walked. And one by one, out of thirst, curiosity, or discontent they came. They drank, they turned away. Willow Bend was split, not by violence, but by choice. Half clung to the old, sacred water, where Solari had once appeared. The other half followed the new source, believing water was just water, and whoever controlled it would control memory itself. Aminah stood on the sidelines, watching. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled as children who once listened to her stories now ran after Isela, clutching bottles of water stamped with a new symbol, a silver wave spilling over the marsh. At night, she heard the wind whistling through the new channels. And it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a call desperate and fractured. Solari was warning her, but this time, not through dreams, through blood. The first people to drink from the new source began speaking strange things. A child wailed, claiming to see their late father's shadow by a tree. An old woman trembled as she heard a lullaby only the Hammond ancestors knew. Some ran to the lagoon's edge at midnight, saying, "They're calling me." Aminah understood. Solari no longer took form, but she was still there, and she no longer sang. She was reclaiming what had been forgotten. She traced the clues. The new water didn't come from a well, not from a natural spring. It came from an artificial pipeline, running through land once sealed a place the village's ancestors had forbidden anyone to touch since the first generation. Isela had broken the seal, not out of thirst, but for power. She didn't need blood. She needed submission. That evening, Aminah returned to the lagoon's edge where Solari had once saved her. The sky wasn't raining, but the ground was wet. The wind wasn't blowing, but the reeds swayed. The water wasn't flowing, but the lagoon's surface rippled. She sat there, silent as an apology that couldn't be spoken. In the thin moonlight, Solari didn't appear. But the light from the black pearl necklace began to flicker like a final warning. If memory is distorted, if the water is controlled, then it's not just one village that will be cursed, but the soul of an entire people. Can you guess what will happen next? Take a moment to relax, comment 1, or "I'm still here," to keep listening. Even water, seemingly transparent and formless, has memory. And that night, when the moon was half veiled by clouds, when the lagoon lay still but murmured as if conversing with the past, Aminah understood it was time to stop being silent. She quietly walked toward the new water source. No banners, no evidence, no accusations. Only a premonition awakened by sounds inaudible to the ear but recognized by the soul. The village market stayed lit late, with people gathered around stalls as if nothing had happened, but behind their gazes lay a silent divide. Jugs of the new source water sat beside dinner trays, on ancestral altars, trusted as blessings. But only Aminah, with her black pearl necklace growing ever murkier, knew that each drop was draining memory from the people, changing them in ways no one noticed. Isela stood in the communal courtyard, her white dress billowing in the wind, as if time had never buried her. But her eyes had changed. She wasn't an obvious enemy, nor a supplicant. She was a mirror reflecting every unhealed wound of the community. When Aminah approached, no one stopped her. No one took sides. The village had learned to stand in the middle, choosing nothing, remembering nothing, taking no responsibility. They looked at each other in silence, not for the first time, but the first time since such deep cracks had formed. Aminah didn't shout, didn't accuse. She only asked softly, just enough for the wind to carry but memory to hold. How much did it hurt? To be forgotten? Isela stood still. For so long it seemed the question had drifted into the night. But then her lips trembled slightly. Eyes once steely now shimmered with tears, not from fear, but because no one had asked that in so long. No one remembered that, before she was a divider, she too had been a child listening to Miss Maisie's stories, had believed in the Hammond bloodline, had written her name in the ancestral book. But that identity was erased when Corey fell, and no one asked if she still belonged to this place. They just turned away. And in the darkness, Isela chose power over memory, because at least power never forgets a name. Aminah listened quietly. She didn't justify, didn't forgive, but in her eyes, for the first time, Isela was no longer a threat, but proof. Proof that pain, if not embraced, becomes a peril. And that forgetting is an act of violence, silent but sharp. A breeze swept through, carrying the faint sound of water lapping against the hull of an old boat where Solari had once sung. That sound was no longer soothing. It was a reminder that the past isn't something to leave behind, but to return to mend. Isela turned away without a word, but her hand released the map of the new water source, letting it drift in the wind, falling right into the old ditch Aminah had cleaned as a child. The map dissolved as if it had never been drawn. That night, beneath the river, the light from Aminah's black pearl flared once more. Not a warning, but a reflection, a signal that there was still hope if we dare to look directly at one another. The morning after, the sky was cloaked in a thin, hazy mist, like a veil over memory. Aminah didn't return home immediately, but went straight to the old communal hall where she had once been judged years ago. The steps were still covered in moss, like an unwashed curse, and the wooden door remained darkened by past rainy seasons. But today, she didn't come with resentment. She carried candles, handwritten papers, and copies of genealogies from the time of the ancestors. She lit an oil lamp on the ancestral altar, its flame flickering as if hesitating between past and present. At her feet was an old ledger, recording the names of those who had lived, died, been remembered, and been forgotten. The villagers began to gather, not summoned by any call, but drawn by something deeper, like the call of blood or the lost songs now echoing back from the river's heart. In the dim light, Isela came too, no longer an adversary, but part of something she hadn't yet named. Aminah didn't stand on a high platform. She sat in the middle of the hall, where she had once knelt. She opened the ledger and read each name, not just the victims, but the wrongdoers and those who had turned away. Those the village had forgotten, erased by history, were now called out as part of a cleansing ritual. There were no accusations, only remembrance. Isela stood at the back, silent. When Aminah reached her name, her voice didn't waver, didn't rise, but it carried far. Isela Hammond, the one who once preserved our roots in silence, and now invited to return, No one objected, no one clapped. But something shifted in the air, in the villager's eyes, in Isela herself. She bowed her head, not out of regret, but because she was seen again as herself. At that moment, a burst of light erupted in the hall, not from the oil lamp, but a reflection from the old ditch's water flowing back. From deep within the village, where the dry well had been sealed, water began to gush, clear and cool. At the same time, a radiant golden figure glimmered in the darkness. Solari, the mermaid with golden scales, appeared behind the hall's wall, not entering, only witnessing. She said nothing, but her eyes held quiet contentment, as if memory itself was the ritual of redemption, needing no magic. The village suddenly broke into song, the old lullaby, once lost to their memory. But today, the words returned, one by one. Across generations, they joined in harmony. No one led, but no one faltered. And in that melody, Willow Bend, the village of water, memory, and lullabies, found itself again. Aminah placed the ancestral ledger on the table, beside a piece of cloth embroidered with a golden fish swimming upstream. Like a wordless declaration that every soul, no matter how far it has drifted, can return if called by truth and compassion. That morning, mist enveloped Willow Bend like a mourning shawl draped across the past, yet no one called it gloomy. It was a peaceful morning, peaceful in the way one only feels after seasons of fierce storms. At the village well, where the water had once run dry and been forgotten, Aminah stood silently by its edge, the black pearl in her hand, reflecting the pale sky. No one gathered around her, no farewells were needed, for her presence, quiet yet profound, had become part of the earth, the water, the village's memory. She wasn't leaving as an exile, but as one who had fulfilled her ritual. When her hand released the pearl, there was no loud sound, only the soft swallow of the water, as if guarding a secret. After the event at the communal hall, when Solari appeared and the lullaby was sung again, things in Willow Bend didn't change instantly, but little by little, the water grew clearer, the laughter of children rang longer. The villagers, once divided by self-interest, began to mend the bonds of community, not through laws, but through memory. And isela, once seen as a symbol of betrayal, was elected to the Water Council. Not for fame, but because trust had been restored through an entire journey. Isela didn't stand at the center, didn't raise her voice, but her calm silence was what taught the villagers to listen again. Under the guidance of the new council, the old water channels were dredged, but the forbidden lagoon was left untouched. Instead of expanding, they learned to live slowly, to live enough. Every jug of water, every basin for washing, every song sung while carrying water became a sacred act, a way to remember and to give thanks. Aminah, after placing the pearl, left in the night. No one knew where she went. Only old Miss Maisie from the balcony of her ancient house smiled as she saw the familiar dark figure disappear behind the trees, quietly as she had come. As for Solari, she no longer appeared. But sometimes, on clear, moonlit nights, the villagers said they heard a wordless song echoing from the river's heart. And those with keen eyes would see the waters stir slightly, as if something glimmering moved gently in the depths. Children sometimes pointed at the water and laughed, claiming they saw a golden scale radiant like sunlight in a glass bottle. The adults neither denied nor confirmed it. They had learned that some things don't need proof, only preservation. In the small room where Aminah once kept her diary, her notebook was left behind, open to the final page. No new words were written. Only a small piece of cloth embroidered with a golden fish swimming in a circle of water, and beneath it, an old handwritten line, "To forgive is not to erase, but to remember without pain." the story of Willow Bend doesn't end. For memory, once cleansed by truth and compassion, will always carve new streams. But has Solari truly left? Or is she merely waiting for someone to lean down to the water, to see her once more? Sometimes, the most painful thing isn't betrayal, but being forgotten. Yet Willow Bend remembered, not with loud remorse, but with the silence of water patient and ceaselessly flowing. Aminah returned, not to reclaim her honor, but to remind us of something simple. Memories, if not held onto with truth, will sooner or later become shadows haunting the generations to come. Solari, the golden-scaled mermaid, left no magic, carried no decree. But her quiet presence made people believe justice doesn't lie in punishment, but in understanding. Forgiveness is not a gift for others, but the only medicine that allows us to move forward. This story isn't just about a distant village. It's a question for each of us. Who have we forgotten? What have we forgiven? And most importantly, what in our hearts needs to be cleansed? If you're still here, thank you for walking this journey with me. Share your feelings by leaving a comment. Who did you connect with in this story? Aminah, Isela, or Solari? Don't forget to like the video and share it with those you think might need a little healing. And if you're ready for part 3, where the water will lead us to a secret never before told, hit subscribe and join me in opening the next door to memory. Because sometimes the oldest stories are the prophecies for ourselves.